Revelation chapter 1, verses 9 to 18. Now, I mentioned before that the theme today is the glorious King. I want to do a bit of a follow-on really from Ascension Day. And so we're not looking at the actual events of Jesus' ascension, but we are looking at some related material to it. And I also decided today that I'm probably dangerous saying this, that as it's a bank holiday weekend, I wouldn't go on as long as normal, okay? So I thought I would keep it short. Then I was reading from a friend on Facebook this morning that he's preaching today at Winchester Cathedral. And he's also had experience of being a long-winded Baptist pastor in the past. And his sermon, which is on the new heaven and the new earth, from Isaiah 65 and Revelation 21. So he's got two passages he's looking at, and he's been given precisely 6 minutes to do it in. What a challenge. What a challenge. So I promise you one thing, we will be longer than 6 minutes, but maybe not 60 minutes, but somewhere in between. Okay, Revelation chapter 1, looking at verse 9, and through to, or reading verse 9 through to verse 18. I, John, your brother and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. And on the Lord's day I was in the Spirit, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet which said, "Write on a scroll what you see and send it to the 7 churches of Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea." And I turned around to see the voice that was speaking to me. And when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And among the lampstands was someone like a son of man, dressed in a robe that reached down to his feet and with a golden sash round his chest. And his head and hair were white as wool, as white as snow. And his eyes were like blazing fire. And his feet were like bronze glowing in the furnace. And his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. And in his right hand he held 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a sharp, double-edged sword. His face was like the sun shining in all its brilliance. And when I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. And then he placed his right hand on me and said, "Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and behold, I am alive forever and ever. And I hold the keys to death and Hades." I was thinking of that verse that is contained within the letter to the Hebrews, which reminds us that Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He does not change. But I also wonder how convinced the Apostle John would have been of those words on this occasion. The last time he saw Jesus, admittedly, it was quite a dramatic situation. They were standing on top of a mountain, and Jesus was giving some final instructions, and they were worshipping him, and he was taken up into heaven. He was in his resurrected state at the time as he went up into heaven. But nevertheless, John had known him over a period of a few years. He had worked with him and walked with him and talked with him. He had been with him, and he had become very close to Jesus, to the point that he is described as the one whom Jesus loved. Jesus had a very special place for John. And yet, here we are all these years later, and we don't know the exact year in which it was, but we're talking several decades later now. John is no longer the young man that he was when he saw Jesus ascend into heaven. And now, after all these decades that have passed, maybe 40, perhaps even 50 years have gone by, and he sees Jesus again. But Jesus doesn't look quite the same anymore. I don't know about you, but I've also noticed that sometimes when there has been a gap of some while between seeing someone now and when I saw them last time, though I notice there are changes too. I often find when going back to visit my parents that in the village that they live in, the thing about village life is that people just stay there forever and ever and ever. They are almost immortal, it sometimes seems. And there are people wandering around the village still that I remember when I was a small child. And some of them, perhaps I haven't even seen for 20 years or so, and I might just be driving around the village myself or something, and I just spot somebody walking along the road, and I think to myself, is that really so-and-so? That can't be. Last time I saw them, they were, probably 40-something, and now they look like they're nearly 70, and I think, that's probably about right. All those years have passed, and they've aged, and they've gone a bit greyer, and, well, it's true to say that Jesus had gone a bit greyer. In fact, more than that, he was white, but not with age, but with glory. Jesus was no longer that young man that he was at his ascension. He wasn't necessarily an old man now, although sometimes the description that John gives of him might seem to portray an old man. But I think what it's really showing us is not that he's young, not that he's old, but that he has changed. And he is now glorified, and he is seeing him in his glorified state. The brightness that shines from him is so dazzling that John describes it as being like the sun in all its brilliance, or like the noonday sun. And you know what it's like, don't you, when the sun is shining at its absolute brightest. And if you're facing the sun, it can be just so overpowering on us that we have to hide our eyes. And John was like that as he saw Jesus. He said the vision was so great, so strong. But he noticed other things about Jesus that had changed. That his clothes were dazzling. They were bright too. I don't know what the washing powder is in heaven, but whatever it is, it does the trick. Better than anything you can get on earth. The brilliance shining from him was so great. Notice also that his eyes were different. He said as he looked at his eyes, they were actually like blazing fire. And sometimes, you see somebody, don't you, and you can kind of see a passion in their eyes. The eyes are an interesting part of the human body. They say so much. They speak volumes about what's really going on inside. And I suspect that Jesus always had that, as we sometimes say, the twinkle in his eye. There was that bright spark there, I'm sure. But this was different. He says his eyes were like fire. But then he notices something strange also about Jesus, something that he'd never seen before, and that is a sharp, double-edged sword coming out of his mouth. Well, last time that he'd seen Jesus, Jesus didn't have a sword at all. In fact, if you remember when Peter got his sword out, Jesus was quite upset about that and told him to put the sword away. The damage was done, but put the sword away, Peter. We're not about weapons. We're not going to fight. So why does he have the double-edged sword coming out of his mouth? And as he looked at him from the top of his head and his vision of Jesus, as his eyes kind of worked down, he then comes down to his feet, and he notices that his feet are like highly polished bronze. Now, I know there are some of you who are fortunate enough that when you see the sun, that you also turn into highly polished bronze. For someone like me who turns into a beetroot, that's quite envious. I only have to look at the sun and I turn bright red. I managed to do it this week even. And, and I think to myself, how is it possible that there I am when it wasn't even particularly sunny? I think it was the snow, actually. I think it's the reflection. I still managed to get absolutely burnt up. But Jesus wasn't sunburnt. This was a difference. This bronze kind of spoke something of the value of him, the fact that he is eternal. The bronze reminds him of someone who is not going to perish. All of those kinds of imagery would come through. But Jesus was most definitely changed from when he had last seen him. So how is it then that the writer to the Hebrews can say Jesus the same yesterday, today, and forever? And let me suggest to you that the problem was not actually that John saw Jesus in a changed state, but that when he had seen him previously, that he had seen Jesus in a veiled state. That actually the full glory of Jesus was already there, but John's eyes couldn't see it before. That when he saw Jesus walking on this earth as a man, that in many respects there was nothing different to him to any other man, in many respects. He looked just like any other human being. He looked like the other people of his day. He fitted into society. I don't know what kind of image you have when you think of Jesus, when you try and picture him in your mind. And I must confess that Sunday school has done me irreparable damage when it comes to Jesus and his image, because I can only ever think of Jesus as being this 1970s Swedish hippie with a white robe and a blue sash, because that was the picture that was presented to us every single Sunday when we were children. And it's difficult to get that out of your mind. But of course, Jesus wasn't like that at all. He came from the Middle East. He would have been dark-skinned, dark-haired. But, it's not so much that image, is it, that we're focusing on here? Because actually he took on the form of human likeness. And Philippians reminds us that when he did so, he humbled himself and became a man. He took on all the attributes of humanity in absolute humility. He left his glory, he left his majesty, he left his throne, and he came down to this earth, his glory veiled. And yet, interestingly, that as we look at the life of Jesus, that glory might have been veiled, and yet from time to time, that veil is just removed even a little bit. And we get a chance to glimpse behind the curtain and see something of the glory and the majesty of Jesus, something of his kingship. The very fact that when he first arrived here on this earth as this tiny little baby, and a few months ago we were celebrating Christmas and reminding ourselves that Jesus came to humble parents, into humble circumstances, into a little town called Bethlehem. And most of the people did not even recognize that the King of Glory had come, except to those to whom he was revealed. There were shepherds out in the fields, as well you are aware, I'm sure. And to them it was revealed that the King had come, and they went to worship him, the Saviour. And there were those foreigners who came from distant lands in the East who, even through their rather unorthodox methods, had discerned that the king had come and came to worship him. Interesting that the Jews themselves, with the scriptures before them, still had their eyes blinded. Well, we don't see much of Jesus after his birth until he's a grown man. And as he comes into his ministry, we begin to see something of his majesty again. Because we see that as Jesus begins his ministry, he goes around healing people, and the people of his day even recognized, the religious leaders recognized, that no ordinary person goes around doing those kind of things. There must be something, some extra power that's at work within him. And yet still they could not see beyond the veil that was over their eyes. They could not see Jesus in all his glory. And yet to some he was revealed. And they recognized that Jesus was no ordinary teacher. He wasn't even a prophet. But he was the Christ, the Messiah, the chosen one of God who had been sent into this world. And they worshipped him as such. Jesus showed his power over nature. And he stands on the boat and commands the wind and the waves, and so they die down before everyone's very eyes. He gets out of a boat, or he walks on the water, and Peter gets out of the boat and he walks towards him, and he realizes then that this is not just Jesus walking on shallow water, but indeed he himself, Peter, has been enabled to walk on the water towards Jesus too. Why? Because Jesus has power over the forces of nature. He took a small amount of bread and fish and multiplied it many, many times over so that it fed thousands upon thousands of people. He didn't do it once, he did it at least twice. Just shows that he is King of creation. He did this so many times, different things, different situations. The cursing of the fig tree is one that often gets overlooked. But it just shows his power over it all. This is the King of glory. And yet their eyes were veiled to who he was in all his glory. And that's not surprising, is it? I want you to go back in your minds to the Old Testament, to the days of Moses. And Moses was a unique character in that he met with the Lord in a very special relationship with him. And having met with God himself, coming face to face with him, he was a changed man. Not just inside in his heart, but visibly too. And it says that when he came out of meeting with God, that he had to put a veil over his face as the glory of God faded. The brightness was so strong, just the reflection of God on his face, that the people could not look upon him. Can you imagine that? Even the reflection they could not look upon. Now, if Jesus is the sun, then Moses is the moon. Just as the sun shines in all its brightness, the moon reflects the sun's glory. And you know as well as I do that sometimes even the moon can be quite spectacularly bright. It may not be to the stage where you have to put your dark glasses on, but you see the principle that the moon is nothing compared to the sun. Moses was nothing compared to Jesus. The brightness of the glory of God looking directly at him was nothing compared to looking at the reflection in Moses' face. And yet the people could not even look upon his face steadily. They had to turn away. Moses puts the veil over his face because the people had no understanding. And if we were to go and study the book of Hebrews, we see that that veil also speaks to us in another way too, of a veil that was over the people's faces in Israel. How they did not recognize God for who he was. They did not see Jesus as the King of glory. But now John has been invited through this vision into the very presence of the risen, ascended, glorified Jesus. And he sees him in a completely different light. He sees him in all his glory. He saw him partially in his glory before. He saw him, if you like, with a veil over his face still. But now the veil is removed and he sees him. And what an amazing thing it is. How amazing it is to see Jesus like that. That John actually falls down as though dead. That's his only response. He is so terrified by the experience. He is overwhelmed by it that he thinks that he's probably about to die anyway. But I love the way in which Jesus meets him in his humility. As he lies prostrate upon the floor, there is the hand that is put upon him. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. He says, I am the first and the last. I was dead, and behold, I am alive forever and ever. And I hold the keys of death and Hades. What do we have to fear? Are you ready to face Jesus? Are you ready to stand before him in all his glory? I sometimes smile when I hear those people say that when I meet Jesus, I'm going to ask him this and I'm going to ask him that. We're not going to ask him anything. It is going to be a terrifying experience. To see him in all his brightness, in all his glory, in all his majesty is going to be so overwhelming for us. I'll tell you what we're going to do is we're going to fall down and worship. We're going to be in absolute awe of him, just as John was. And as we continue reading Revelation, we find that there is just constant worship taking place. That time after time, it just seems that heaven is filled with worship. One group of creatures are worshipping. Then another group start worshipping. Then some angels begin to worship. And it's just this wall-to-wall worship that is going on the whole time. That everyone is just bowing down before him, casting down their crowns before him. Now, if we were to skip to the end of the book, we find that there is Jesus coming in all his glory again, as he rides out as a conqueror to conquer. And on his head were many crowns. That all of the crowns of this world are upon his head. That he takes total dominion of everything. Now we have a choice, my friends. We can bow the knee voluntarily now, or we can wait till later. You see, what we see at the moment of Jesus is still a veiled Jesus. We do not see him in all his fullness and in all his glory. And that is why we still have in our minds these inadequate pictures of Jesus. And although I kind of say tongue-in-cheek about the irreparable damage that Sunday school did to me in the image of Jesus, there's something that's half serious about that. That we have actually portrayed Jesus as being this gentle Jesus, meek and mild, rather than this glorious Jesus who rides out as a conqueror to conquer. One who is coming back to claim what is rightfully his. One who shows mercy, yes, on those who turn to him, but who pours out his wrath and his anger on those who reject him. That's a tough Jesus. And you might say, that sounds a bit harsh. Yes, it does, but that's because we have got this poor image of who Jesus is. And I'd love to see us as the church redressing the balance of the image of Jesus. To see him not just as this man who walked on the earth for 3 years, doing good things, teaching good things, saying good things, being nice to people, but one who come and he says, yes, today is the day of grace, but tomorrow is the day of judgment. We're here because we have been given time. That's why it's called the day of grace. We've been given time in order to turn and to repent and to worship him and to give our lives to him and to serve him now. And yet so many choose to reject him. One day we will all have to stand before his throne. One day we will all have to give account of ourselves. One day we will all see him in that terrifying state. And it's no joke. The wonderful thing is that, you see, if you're on the right side of Jesus, then you have nothing to fear. Yes, it's going to be the most amazing experience that you will ever have had and ever will have. But you have nothing to fear. John falls down as though dead. But Jesus says, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. John, you've been a faithful servant. You have served me all your life. You've not turned your back on me. You have suffered for the gospel. John is on the island of Patmos because of the gospel. He says, you have nothing to be afraid. But I pity those who will one day stand before him, who have rejected him all their lives, who've never bowed the knee to him, who've never served him, who've doubted him. And I want to say to you today, if that's you, please don't doubt him anymore. People sometimes say to me, but you know, I would like to become a Christian. And it's not that I really don't believe in Jesus. It's just that, you know, I just kind of like my life the way it is. And the thing about following Jesus is that, you know, it means I have to make changes to my life. Yeah, that's true. But, you know, the wonderful thing is that actually when we give up the life that we have and make the changes that he demands in our lives, that we will become people fashioned more and more into his likeness, that we find that we add to life, not take away from it. Jesus came to give us life in all its fullness. And yeah, there are certain things as Christians that we couldn't be part of. Certain things that are considered as enjoyable and part of life in the world around us. And we'd have to say as Christians, you know, we don't want to be killjoys, but on the other hand, that would be dishonoring to my Lord. So yeah, there are restrictions, there are boundaries, but they are there not to spoil your life, but to enhance it. And the more we follow him, and the more we serve him, and the deeper that we go with him, the more we find that he gives to us. And Jesus said of his followers, he said, when they come to me, he said that they will give up many things, that is true. But he says they will also gain 100-fold whatever they've lost. Never be afraid to follow Jesus. Never be afraid of what you will lose. Think instead of what you will gain. Let's pray.